Welcome and good day to everyone. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I am Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business Economics here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm delighted to introduce today a very exciting event where we will be discussing Europe, European-Chinese relations, the automotive sector, electric vehicles, and where things go from here in terms of all these different topics. We have some very esteemed guests. We have Deputy Director General at DG Trade, Maria Martin-Prat, who I'll be introducing in just a moment, followed at 9:30 by a very expert panel with my colleague Max Bergmann, Julia Poliscanova from TNE, and Thomas König from the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I will be introducing them later on. And before I move on to Ms. Martin-Prat, let me just set the scene a little bit about some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. Europe finds itself in an interesting position today, where it is evaluating anew its economic and defense priorities, rethinking its economic strategy, and where competitiveness is now a key topic of conversation in Brussels. This comes at a time in which the relationship with China has become increasingly complex, and concerns about competition with China have increased, and especially about industrial policy use in China and increasing exports in some sectors towards Europe. Nowhere is that complexity as evident as in the automotive sector. EVs have become perhaps the most high-profile sector in which the European Commission has launched an investigation. The investigation was initiated in 2023, and it led to tariffs late last year. This has increased tension with Beijing. Obviously, China and the European Union are very important trading partners for each other, and that's led to some interesting situations. We know that the Commission and the Chinese government are negotiating, and hopefully we'll be hearing more about that. I'd also be remiss if I didn't note the commercial relations between Europe and the United States are also becoming more difficult. And that is not the topic of today, but I expect that it is also shaping discussions around China. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our key speaker for today. Ms. Maria Martin-Prat is Deputy Director General and the Directorate-General responsible for trade and economic security in the European Commission. She is currently responsible for Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and the Caribbean. She's also responsible for sustainable development and Green Deal trade-related issues, services and digital trade, investment, and intellectual property. Before her current post, Ms. Martin-Prat was the director in DG Trade. Before that, she was consecutively head of unit responsible for free movement of services and freedom of establishment, and head of the copyright unit in the European Commission. She was also member of the cabinet of Commissioner Joaquim Almunia. Ms. Martin-Prat has worked as a lawyer in the private sector and in the European Parliament, and is admitted as a solicitor in Spain. Ms. Martin-Prat, welcome so much to our event today.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, and it's a pleasure to be able to engage in discussions with CSIS members on topics that are very close to the work we are doing day to day here at the moment. You've asked me to speak about EV trade issues and EU-China relations, but in particular, as regards EU-China relations, I think this is a subject that we need to discuss, keeping in the background the EU-US relations. It's very difficult to talk about our relations with China without talking about our relations with the US. So I'll touch upon EU-China first, then I'll move on to EU-US coordination on China second, and then I will address the EV trade issues that you were referring to. So starting with China, it's I think known by everybody, but important to repeat, is for the Europeans our third largest trading partner after the US and the UK. But we do have a relationship that I will not hesitate to refer to as critically unbalanced. Even if we trade more than 2 billion a day, there is a deficit in our trade, which has become very substantial, and we're not obsessed by trade deficit for the sake of trade deficit. I want to be clear about this. We are very concerned about the Chinese trade deficit with Europe because it's the result of a number of practices and policies in China, which are very problematic for us. First, what we see is that China has a clearly export-led growth strategy, and we see no signs that China is ready to make this more sustainable. We believe that manufacturing exports will continue to be a very important part of their economy, and that will have substantial and negative effects for us, in particular in terms of overcapacity. We also don't see China moving away from what are basically very destructive industrial policies. In a way, you have heard, and this is often mentioned by politicians, including our president, we are facing now a second China shock. There is, in total, a situation where China operates a surplus with 75% of its trading partners. So it's not only the European Union or the US, it's not only developed, but it's also many emerging economies and developing countries that get affected by Chinese overcapacity. And the imbalance we have in our trade with China is not only because of their exporting of overcapacities, but it's also because of the problems in terms of barriers and discriminations that our companies face when they do try to trade with China or invest in China, run a business in China. What we see is that the situation is not improving, it's rather worsening. The European Chamber of Commerce in China, that does an annual survey of the situation, continues to accumulate a list of problems that need to be addressed by the Chinese administration that this year hit the number of 1,000, so 1,000 barriers. And what we see as well is that the business confidence, our business confidence in the presence in China or engagement with China is continuing to go down. Now, we are acting to defend our economy and our interests. We have increased the use of TDI. You were referring to the BEV tariffs, but we do far more than BEVs. And actually, of all of the TDI cases we have open at the moment, 60% relate to China, directly or indirectly, sometimes directly, but we do also target practices that China goods from China via third countries, and don't hesitate to then use TDI in those cases. We are also deploying now quite actively the use of the foreign subsidies regulations, so a particular new instrument that allows us to tackle the negative effects of Chinese subsidies, not when they get embedded in the goods that get imported into the European Union, but in the investments or participation in public procurement instruments. And we see our companies at a disadvantage when they try to compete for those investments or public procurement operations. So of that type of work, this instrument, which is relatively new, has so far led to 5 investigations, of which 4 related, because there are a couple of them close to China. And we are also, and I'm sure you have noticed that, increasing the inclusion of resilience criteria in our internal market legislation, in particular as regards, again, public procurements and subsidies. But in general, there's far more of an understanding that there are certain critical dependencies that we cannot afford having with China. Also, in the area of public procurement, we have concluded a first investigation under the international procurement industry. So it's a difficult relation also, because now it's very clear, something that we have seen in the past, but one tends to forget sometimes. It's also very clear that China is quite ready to use trade dependencies as a weapon. So that weaponization of trade dependencies, we have seen at the moment in retaliatory actions taken against or in reaction to the BEV tariffs. That's why, at least in our view, China has opened anti-subsidies and in one case anti-dumping investigations for pork, for dairy, for brandy. And we also see China expanding their list of controls, export controls, in a manner that clearly departs from the pure dual-use justification and is becoming increasingly large and general. So the situation is difficult. Having said that, we do understand the importance of engaging with the second economy in the world. And actually, this week, the day after tomorrow, the Trade and Economic Security European Commissioner, Commissioner Šefčovič, will be visiting China. I'll be going with him. We'll be going to China to have a first meeting between my commissioner and the Chinese Trade Minister Wang Wentao. And there will also be discussions with other interlocutors, including with Vice Premier He Lifeng. We think that is an engagement that we need to discuss issues of concern, to avoid misunderstandings, and to manage the relationship in a responsible manner. We want to pass a very clear message to our Chinese interlocutors, which is basically to say we are not pursuing decoupling, but we consider that the current situation, the current imbalance in our trade and investment relations is not tenable. We will always favor a constructive engagement to address a number of these issues, but we want an engagement that delivers concrete results and not only engagement for the sake of engagement. And we think it is important to pass a clear message that China cannot take for granted the openness of the European internal market. We will see how these discussions go. At this moment, I have no reason to believe that engagement, as important as it is, will do away with the need to continue with our de-risking policy, to use trade defense, and to use other autonomous instruments. And here is where I make the link to the US, the need to partner with others to address common problems created by China remains. And there, partnering has been long an essential element of our relationship with the United States. And obviously, it will be a very, very important element if we can get that going forward. These days, I find myself very often reminding myself and those I speak to about the importance that the economic relationship between the EU and the US has been, as we are very, very close intertwined economies and economies that have relied on each other for a long time. We clearly don't want a confrontation, a trade war with the US, and we do share the concerns that the US has voiced very clearly for a number of years now as to the problems created by China's non-market policies and practices. So our proposition for the US is very clear. It will be far more effective if we can work together, both on matters related to the level playing field, but also in matters related to security. There is not such a thing as an effective policy to address national security concerns, real national security concerns, if this is not done in coordination with others, at least vis-a-vis some of the problems we have with China. So on this particular issue, our offer will stand. We want to tackle the challenge that China poses to us together. Now, it's a different matter whether there is a space in Washington to consider this proposition at this stage. But that is something that I think is important to keep in mind. And then if we go to the situation with the battery energy vehicles and the new way forward, as you say, we did last October concluded an anti-subsidy investigation by imposing definitive countervailing duties on imports of battery electric vehicles from China. This was the result of a long, careful process and a lot of work. We base the actual amounts of the subsidies received by the companies on an individual basis, and we made sure that the measures were targeted on the basis of the characteristics of the companies, the subsidies they have received, the cooperation we have had through the investigation. The duties that enter into force at the end of October will be now in place for 5 years. Now, in parallel, we have continued to explore alternative solutions. This is something that is stated in the regulation that we adopted at the time of the imposition of the tariffs. So we are ready to consider alternative solutions. And as the regulation itself said, a solution in the form of a price undertaking can be identified and implemented even after the imposition of definitive measures. So in other words, the fact that the measures are in place does not cut the possibility to engage. But, and this is a very important but, any solution that we could consider will need to be effective as the tariffs in addressing the problems that we are trying to redress. And it also needs to be WTO compatible. There's been intensive engagement with China. I'm not sure at this stage I will call it negotiations. And the reality, but that is not a secret, is that this far we have not found a solution that will meet the criteria of effectiveness and WTO compatibility, nor solutions that will allow us to do a real monitoring as to their implementation and be therefore really enforceable. So that is where we are. In a way, although we will be ready to move on and start discussing other things with China, it's still playing a very prominent role in our bilateral discussions. I am sure we'll hear a lot about BVs in the mission of Commissioner Šefčovič to China later in the week. But again, as I said, we are confident as to how solid our the outcome of our TDA investigation is, and we will always be willing to hear if there is an alternative effective solution that can be put on the table. Now, what is happening at the same time in relation to the discussion on the automotive industry, and more specifically EVs in Europe, is that we are moving beyond, if you want, trade policy and trade remedies into the investment policy area. And you were referring to that as well, Ilaria. We're not just talking about the need to level the playing field, but increasingly about the need to support the competitiveness of the automotive industry in the European Union. You may have read the recently adopted Automotive Action Plan, where you will find a very clear formulation of this idea of needing to ensure that foreign investment in the sector in the European Union brings value. This is understandable. The automotive industry has been for decades a driving force for the EU economy in terms of growth, in terms of job creation. Is an industry that does contribute to our trade surplus by some 168 billion euros in 2023. So that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. It's also, but I think it's not only in the EU, is an industry that is at a crossroad at the moment. It's navigating a transition while at the same time facing a very fierce and, as far as China is concerned, unfair competition. In the long run, we think that this is a transition that should present opportunities, not only in terms of growth, but also in terms of development of technologies, intensive investment, a redefinition of supply chain processes, and the possibility as well to adapt better to the preferences of the consumer. but this is at the moment a very, very difficult task. So in a way, we are looking to try to define policies that will support the competitiveness of the industry during this transition. Now, China is an extremely powerful actor in the sector because of the mastering of the technology, the know-how in terms of the manufacturing of electronic vehicles, and they do control all along the supply chain, so all of the key elements. And the reality is that they are a very, very important competition. This is now also very clear in terms of investments of China into the European Union. What we have seen is that these investments are increasingly focusing in the automotive sector, more specifically in the electric vehicle sector. And here I include both the manufacturing of EVs, but also batteries. At the moment, when we look at trends in the last year, we were at 60 to 70% of Chinese investment in Europe dedicated to this sector. So we are facing a new reality and a new discussion. The discussion being those investments in particular, but not only when they are greenfield investments, what type of value, what type of support to the competitiveness of local manufacturing and economic growth and job creation are they bringing? And there the reply is quite mixed. You do have some investments where you could really challenge that they provide anything but just simply an assembly plant facility. So this is something that is being discussed. This is something that I think will be part of the discussions as well between my commissioner and his Chinese interlocutors. And probably you will see some further policy developments going forward. But at this point, this is where we are. I hope I did not speak for too long, and I gave you a little bit of a quick overview of what you had asked me to discuss, but happy to go further or deeper on any point you may want to discuss.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think very informative, and I think it covered a lot of different areas that I certainly have been thinking about. And as I said, I've just written a paper on some of these topics, so I've been looking at these. But I think also generally many people, both in Washington and beyond, are grappling with. And I think the implications of Chinese foreign direct investment in a sector like the automotive sector are quite important, both for Europe and other countries as well. You don't need to comment on this, but foreign subsidies regulation. There's been reporting that this has been, that the Commission is in early stages of an investigation on the BYD plant in Hungary. So certainly we're hearing a lot of activity happening already. And I think, also some of the high-level documents that have come out of the Commission in the last couple of months have also mentioned sort of what you just noted, the importance of actually sort of ensuring that investment brings in value added. So that's certainly something that we'll all be keeping our eyes out and hearing, hoping to hear more after the visit next week. I think I have a couple of questions, and I think one is how do you view sort of the changing dynamics in global trade? The year is starting off with tariff threats from Washington. There's certainly all the challenges that you've mentioned with managing the commercial relationship with China, TDIs, trade defense instruments. But at the same time, the EU has been very proactive about, closing new deals and initiating new deals with Mercosur, India. So is this the year of free trade or of trade defense for Europe? What do you think?
That's a nice way to put it. Is it trade defense or is it trade negotiations? I think it's both. Well, it's really is a very, very busy year, and past year and likely going forward is going to be even busier. But you're right, you do have a huge amount of activity, trade defense, and the use of other autonomous instruments we have, whether related to the level playing field or to security. Think about FDI screening for security purpose. Think about export control. All these will remain central to the work we are doing. But you're right that at the same time, because we are also acutely aware of the need to diversify, we are speeding up in negotiations. And these things don't happen unilaterally. It's not that we decide that we want to negotiate more actively with others, and then that works in the manner we want. What we see as well is that we have third countries that are far more interested in engaging, sometimes in negotiations that have been left aside because there was not sufficient level of ambition. They are coming now, I would like to think, because there is the sense that we are a responsible partner that is still capable of negotiating agreements and to have trade policies based on rules and based on the benefit of both parties. So indeed, when you saw at the end of the year the conclusion of Mercosur and of Mexico, I don't think those announcements came just by chance. When you see that negotiations in Southeast Asia that had been left aside for a number of years because they were not progressing, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, they are back. We have the teams. We are negotiating. We have ongoing negotiations with other countries. You have mentioned India. Yes, that's always a challenge, but one that again is a priority for the Commission at the moment. And in general, we are trying to engage also with more specific and targeted instruments, because sometimes we all know that FTA are very, very big endeavors, and there are other ways to look into trade and investment these days. For instance, we just announced at the last summit of the EU with South Africa a couple of weeks ago that we'll start negotiating what we refer to as a clean trade and investment partnership, which basically is looking into the opportunities to invest, which are very often, in the case of South Africa, backed by EU funds channeled through the global gateways or the just energy transitions. Opportunities to invest to the benefit of the local economies, but also the benefit of our investors, i.e. the possibility also to lift barriers and obstacles to those investments. So yes, there is it's very hectic at the moment, both on the defense side and on the partner side. Yeah.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question, but before you go, and I know you're quite busy, so thank you so much for taking the time. But let me just ask this. Some in Washington would say that when the European Union follows WTO rules or seeks to negotiate with China, questions like, overcapacity, structural reform, and market access, that the EU is somewhat naive. What would you say?
We hear that a lot. Look, I think what is important is to make a difference between the state of multilateral trade and the WTO at the moment and the need for multilateral rules now and in the future. So I think we all agree that the organization needs a reform, that it has been in a state where many discussions and decisions that should have been taken have not been possible in the last couple of ministerial conferences or more. So it's not in a good shape. But at the same time, I always challenge people to think what it will be to trade without the infrastructure provided by the WTO. 55% of our daily trade in Europe is done on the basis of the WTO tariffs and the MFN principle that WTO applies. And if that is for us, you should look into what the WTO rules and framework means for many other countries that have less of a capacity to negotiate preferential trade agreements as we do. So the economic interest is there. Even if there are big problems with the organization and the blockage of the dispute resolution mechanism, the appeal mechanism in particular, but there are still lots and lots of discussions, whether it is on technical barriers to trade, whether it's SPS, that happen in Geneva. So the importance of the system is something I think we will only realize if one day it collapses, but I hope we don't see that happening. And then, let's be clear, the European Union is interested in a rules-based trade because that's how we function. We are a group of 27 countries with different sizes of countries and economies. We have no interest in having a world that is ruled by just a couple of powerful big economies. I think that sense is not unique to the European Union. I think you have many countries in the world that think exactly the same.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great, starting point for our conversation, which we'll be continuing in just a second. But I just want to take the time to thank you for joining us and for giving us this update from Brussels. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, and I would have liked to stay for the discussion, but anyways, have a very good discussion.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Let me now turn to our panel and let me introduce them just very briefly, just in the interest of time. They all have very interesting and long bios, so I would encourage people to look them up online. We have Julia Poliscanova, Senior Director for Vehicles and E-Mobility Supply Chains in the Brussels office of T&E, Transport and Environment, which is a very high-profile European think tank that focuses on issues of transport and environment. Julia, welcome. We have Thomas König, Director for China at the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry, DIHK, which is Europe's largest trade association. He is also a Taiwan-US Europe Policy Program Fellow and a McCloy Fellow on Global Trends from the American Council on Germany, which I'm mentioning because that's how I met Thomas. He's doing very interesting research, which I'm sure will be he'll be bringing in our conversation. And finally, my colleague Max Bergmann, the Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program and the Stewart Center in Euro-Atlantic and North European Studies here at CSIS. And really, one of my colleagues I always go to anytime I have a question regarding Europe, which is pretty often. So Max, welcome. Thomas, Julia. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to very quickly move first to Thomas, just to sort of get your reaction, of course, to Ms. Martin-Prat's speech, but also if you could just sort of set the scene a little bit for us on the broader challenges in the EU-China relationship, economic security, but also, you're representing businesses. What is the perspective on the relationship between China and Europe at the moment?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ilaria. And also thank you so much for mentioning the American Council in Germany and also my very own organization for making it possible for me to kind of having spent the last month in DC to kind of really recharge myself with like what's going on in DC to look at the US-China / Germany / Europe relationship. And, I can already tell you I'm going to be returning to Berlin ready for action and with a lot of thoughts and ideas on how to recalibrate our relationship at large. I think what Ms. Maria Prat said is, first of all, very much essential, but also goes very much against what I've been hearing as well here in DC. I think it was very important to also acknowledge the expansion of the European Union's toolbox when it comes to the topic of economic security and also safeguarding European interests and the rethinking and reshaping of our general thinking, not just about the Chinese market, but just how Europe positions itself in general. And also Ms. Maria Prat also mentioned, of course, the importance of the WTO and rules-based trade, which, of course, we are a big proponent of as well. I can also tell you with all the interlocutors that I've been talking to here in the United States and especially in DC, there's a lot of people who are not a big fan of the WTO at the current, state because, I've been hearing as long as China is part of the WTO, there's no way forward for the WTO to actually be taken seriously by the United States. That's disconcerting. And I think, though, that we have to acknowledge that reality and we have to go with it. And we have to kind of also take our own European lessons when we address, trade with China, when we address our own, car industry and all of that. Just in very broad terms, and then narrowing it down a little bit, basically one of the takeaways for me as well, the Bill Clinton presidential election campaign in 1992, they were all about it's the economy, stupid. For me, it's the economic security, stupid. That's basically what I'm taking home for me as well. There's an incredible need for Germany in this case, but of course also the European Union to acknowledge the importance of creating and better also shaping the whole topic of economic security and promoting it as well, and doing this confidently as well towards our partners. And especially also towards China, because right now we are at crossroads in terms of like figuring out how we present ourselves to our partners and also to our competitors, and how we also like what kind of messages we would like to send to, for example, China or the United States as well, which, by the way, let's also never lose track of the fact that the United States is an incredibly important trading partner of the European Union. We have, like I looked that up as well. I think in the European FDI stock in the last 20 years in the US was at about $3.4 trillion US. Same numbers for EU FDI stock in the last 20 years into China is about 185 billion euros. So, there is a huge the discrepancy between, how much we are trading with those different countries. And I know, especially in Germany, everyone is always thinking, oh, it's all about China. But, I also want to take the second just to emphasize the United States relationship with the European Union matters greatly, and we can leverage it, we can use it. And I think Ms. Maria Prat also mentioned that it's just important to keep that in mind as well when we are engaging with the current American administration, and also, of course, when we're talking to our Chinese counterparts. In general, I also want to bring some bad news because, of course, we're also talking about the car industry. And, even though I have to look at the bigger picture, just if we're looking at the numbers, Germany's car industry is looking at losing another 85,000 jobs by the end of 2035. Just between 2019 and 2023, the industry already lost about 45,000 jobs. So, Ilaria, also your paper is going to be very timely to kind of looking into what the car industry actually can do to address this kind of general trend of losing competitiveness and also being unable to kind of go with the times in a lot of ways. And I know it's also difficult to hear for the car makers and the car industry. I'm in constant contact, of course, with the German Car Makers Association. They're very good colleagues of mine. But there has to be a reckoning as well on the basic company level as well that, we needed kind of rethinking and readjustment, which brings me back to it's the economic security is stupid, because I think as long as we don't understand that, it's not just about the bottom line, but also about safeguarding European interests in the long term, and also making sure that we are restructuring our own industries to make sure that we are also solid for the next decades when it comes to engaging with partners like China, then, I think the trend that I just mentioned before is going to continue, and we certainly do not want that. So I think now is the perfect time also to have this event, but also to take seriously the lessons from current economic trends when it comes to overall competitiveness of certain sectors. And I think the car industry is a perfect example of that. We just kind of have to wake up a little bit and kind of acknowledge that as well. And just to finish up, because I don't want to use too much time, I think, if you also look at the German-Chinese relationship in particular, because, that's what I've also been researching, there's also needs to be a little bit of a rethinking and also acknowledging the necessity of economic security when it comes to that. At the end of last year, there was the CRITIS Umbrella Act that was introduced by the previous administration, which is basically about outlining and kind of defining what critical infrastructures are and what kind of economic security measures we could actually implement to ensure that we will have a sustainable relationship with China. Now the time has come for the new administration, which is, just basically picking up the pencil now to start working to kind of implement that CRITIS Act, which I think is going to be a very important signal as well to show that we are taking economic security as Germany and also as an important member of the European Union seriously. And then, like when it comes to outbound investments and investment screening in general, I think there needs to be more coordination in general. I think the general trend of Chinese investments into the European market will continue, but we do need to be better at kind of coordinating that. And of course, I know that, we have the 2020 EU framework for foreign direct investment screening. That's a good start, but I think we can do much better when it comes to coordination of those efforts as well. And to make sure that we basically talk more and also, communicate to China that we're also talking more. I think that's going to help. And then finally, if I always think about the US, current trends are, there's going to be difficulties with the EU and the United States to engage with each other. Sure, it might be challenging, especially also based on from what I'm currently hearing. But, when it comes to cybersecurity or autonomous driving and the security concerns that might raise, I still see a lot of potential for coordination between the US and Europe to kind of coordinate their efforts on that sense as well when it comes to basically cyber defense and all those things. So, there is room for coordination, for cooperation, and that's why no one should despair. We should just, start implementing now. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Thomas. That was very inspiring and a call for action, I think. Let's move to Julia. We haven't talked as much about the energy transition, but clearly when it comes to electric vehicles, that's sort of in the background, and I think in the foreground as well, right? It's a sort of a key element. And I think, you know, it's really important to go back to the question of what does this whole trade tension, the economic security issue, how does that play into the deployment of electric vehicles in the European Union? What does it mean for meeting European Union's goals? Will it slow things down? Or are there opportunities there? And also, Julia, you are in Brussels. Give us the view from Brussels as well.
Absolutely. A bit like Maria joining from Brussels. So thanks a lot for also having me and TNE at this webinar. I think it's can't be a better timing to talk about that. And there's a few really interesting initiatives indeed happening in this space right now, as Maria was also talking about. So what I will do in the next 7 minutes or so is talk briefly about the automotive and where we stand with that. Then I'll talk about batteries, where I believe the problem is actually a lot larger and the action is more urgently needed. And then I'll indeed finish on some of my and TNE's take on where do we go from here and what do we actually need. So first of all, let's turn to automotive. Electric vehicles are at the heart of the energy transition. We just last week published the update of transport emissions in Europe, and we still see that 3/4 of all CO2 emissions in Europe come from road transport. And the solution to that is or are electric vehicles. There is no better solution. It's already possible, available. The good news is that we do and can manufacture electric vehicles in Europe. That's the capacity and the technology we have, but we have been slow developing that as we've just been too focused on diesels and all the other things that manufacturers like in Europe. Now, when it comes to China, the electric vehicle exports from China, so China-made EVs, have really been growing, especially in the last few years. In 2023, 1 in 5 EV sales was made in China. Last year, it was already 1 in 4. Interestingly, half of all those exports from China are actually by Western brands. So it's our manufacturers, be it Tesla from the US or Renault, for example, that are also manufacturing there. But the biggest growth in terms of exports is definitely by Chinese companies. And here BYD really comes to the fore. Why it's so important and why we have been worrying about that? Well, because we do have huge jobs, value, and GDP, which is dependent on the automotive industry. So this is why we indeed saw the announcement and the confirmation of tariffs last year. Following the tariffs, we have seen some impact actually from them. So some of the growth in China-made EV exports into Europe has actually slowed. For example, MG, owned by SAIC, that has seen the highest tariff put on that, has indeed seen sales actually going down. Now, there is a little bit of a window of opportunity there because hybrids are not covered by tariffs. So where MG and some others are, of course, increasing their imports into the EU or exports from China into the EU today is in the hybrid space, especially some of their really good plug-in hybrids. But overall, MG BEV sales are down. BYD's strategy is more focused on localizing manufacturing. So their factory in Hungary is likely to start production by the end of this year. If it does, it will be the fastest EV factory ever built in Europe. And Geely, another major manufacturer, is somewhere in between. Their sales are stagnating a little bit, but importantly, their major brand in Europe, Volvo Cars, are relocating the manufacturing of one of their affordable models, EX30, back to Europe, which is good news for the country I'm in, Belgium, because it would be their Belgian factory here in Ghent that will be benefiting. So there has been actually impact of those tariffs. And it is important to make sure that whether it's local manufacturing by the Chinese here, and I'll talk about that a bit later, or whether it's European manufacturing, but we keep the manufacturing base. I did note Maria Martin-Prat talking about still the discussions, the negotiations with China ongoing. I think we're all aware that indeed the tariffs haven't yet been finally confirmed. However, I do worry about price undertaking as the solution. Any solution must tackle the core issue of volume as opposed to price. We want to make sure that there is the market for locally made products in Europe. The price is not so much of an issue. In fact, what we see is that many Chinese brands are selling their EVs in Europe at a major premium. They're not trying to undercut the costs. Someone like BYD last year, before the tariffs, saw their profit margins around 40%. So as opposed to the price war in China, they are enjoying the margins, and it's not some kind of anti-dumping that's going on. The issue is really about volumes and capturing the market. Now, let me move to batteries. So I believe that the situation with batteries is even worse. On the one hand, there is huge overcapacity in China of cheap, abundant, and really good batteries that they can easily import into Europe at a laughable 1.3% import tariff on batteries. On the other hand, we are struggling in Europe. So while we can make EVs, we might be too slow, we might be focusing on engines for too long, but we know how to make EVs. We actually today do not have expertise in making lithium-ion batteries. And this is a big problem. We did try. We started in Europe already in 2017 with the European Battery Alliance. If you calculate all of the plants in Europe to date, announcements are up to 1.5 terawatt hours of capacity by 2030. On paper, we can be self-sufficient, but in practice, especially the European investments are not going ahead. You all know about Northvolt. Northvolt finally filed for bankruptcy also in Sweden, I think now 2 weeks ago. But the issue is way more structural than that. It's not about Northvolt. It's about us in Europe really struggling to scale competitive commercial manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries. We're good at research, we can build pilot lines, but when it comes to this scaled manufacturing at high quality with high yields, this is where we are struggling. And a number of companies that are 1 or 2 years behind Northvolt are currently facing similar challenges. An additional challenge is that we have invested everything in a specific nickel-rich chemistry, while the market today is moving to the affordable LFP battery chemistry, and we have almost no industrial capacity or plans for that in Europe. So it looks really, really difficult when it comes to batteries. Now, around a third of investments into battery factories in Europe is by Chinese companies. Another quarter, by the way, is by South Korean companies, and these are more likely to go ahead. Which brings me to the third point: what would be a potential way out in this, given that we do need, for energy transition, but also for resilience and energy security, local battery manufacturing. In my view, we should be open in Europe to Chinese and Asian manufacturing. But what we do need is to make sure that it comes with local value, true technology transfer and skills, as opposed to those assembly plants that Maria Martin-Prat was also referring to. We as TNE just conducted an analysis looking in some of the current joint ventures in the area of batteries, in this case, that are happening in Europe. One is the partnership between Volkswagen and Gotion. Another one is the more recent joint venture between CATL and Stellantis. And what we see is no meaningful technology transfer or skills transfer today. It's really about securing cheaper LFP battery supplies for more affordable EVs in Europe. But the problem is not so much the car makers. We do have best practices. We believe that the Tesla CATL licensing deal in the US is a good one. But it's not because Stellantis are rubbish and Tesla is so good. It's because in Europe, we have no framework that would give that leverage to Western companies to negotiate better joint ventures. In China, there were not Chinese companies that are excelling at that. It was clear Chinese policy. In the US today, you also have a clear policy around foreign entity of concern. We don't have that in Europe. Now, the good news is indeed that the Commission has announced as part of the automotive plan just 2 weeks ago that they will be working on some sort of framework around foreign direct investment, including batteries. And Maria just confirmed that as well. And we're really eagerly waiting for that. But we need something that would be enforceable, that all the member states would enforce equally. We are as weak as the weakest link. And if countries with more investment, be it Hungary or Spain, decide to be more lenient, then the whole thing falls apart. And we need that to have that framework, to have clear conditions and parameters around majority stake, local control IP, as well as use of local suppliers. And if that comes on board, and it comes quickly because joint ventures are happening, investments are happening, we still have a chance to catch up around battery technology. But that window of opportunity is closing down. So I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And we'll come back, I think, to the issue of implementation and coordination between member states on these types of issues, which I think gets to Thomas's call for action on economic security as well. But let me turn to Max. Max, let's take a step back and just, we've been talking about economic security, but let's talk about, how does this fit into economic security and strategy? Certainly, Europe is also facing very difficult choices on defense. And also difficult choices potentially in the transatlantic relationship. How does this all fit in, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be, this whole conversation is going to be central to Europe's broader strategy toward China and also the United States. I think what is clearly going to happen is a degree of Europe is going to have to figure out its own China policy. And what I think we've seen over the last few years during the Biden administration is tremendous alignment between the U.S. and Europe when it came to China, and that was in part not simply because I think it was in the Commission's interest to sort of align with the Biden administration on their sort of top foreign policy priority, but it was because Europeans themselves had come to sort of see similarly to U.S. businesses in the United States that there were real challenges doing business with China, Chinese behavior and how China was operating, both in the world and economically, was a challenge to Europe. And so there was real U.S.-European alignment. However, I think going forward, what we've seen in a number of countries throughout the world is why choose between the U.S. And China when you can sort of hedge between the two actors. That kind of hedging rationale will, I think, really materialize. There's a number of different variables here. So first is kind of the state of transatlantic relations. Will U.S.-EU relations sort of slide into the abyss? Unfortunately, I think there's a real chance that happens, both on the security side, where we're already seeing real tension at kind of the NATO level and U.S. commitment to Europe. I expect major troop withdrawals to be announced by the Trump administration. But then, just this weekend with the U.S. announcing kind of a continued focus on trying to sort of make Greenland as part of the United States, I mean, that's going to lead to a major collision between the U.S. and the EU. So you have all these other issues that will then impact, I think, the trade side as well as U.S. Europe China policy. Then I think the other variable is China. On the one hand, the foreign policy analysts like me will say, okay, that makes a lot of sense if the United States is not being a reliable actor, that the Europeans will turn to China. The real question is, how does China respond? I think we saw Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference talk about a rules-based international order. It may not be a liberal rules-based international order, but at least a rules-based one, which may be quite enticing to the Europeans. On the other hand, you have this problem of China being a major provider to the Russian defense industry. You also have the mere fact that Europe's clean tech and manufacturing sectors are in direct competition with Chinese clean tech and other manufacturing sectors, as this conversation is about. So economically, I think the economists, and Ilaria, we were a part of a really good conversation with Brad Setzer, an event we did at CSIS, where a lot of skepticism toward that there's some sort of economic deal, a new trade and investment agreement, as was reached at the end of the first Trump term, led by Angela Merkel, really makes sense for Europe economically. And then I think maybe another just foreign policy question here is, what do the Asian democracies do vis-a-vis Europe? Do they engage EU leaders to try to say, okay, if the United States is turning away from free trade, maybe let's band together? You saw the commissioner sort of talk about how busy she was and how busy the EU is engaging with other countries. But when we talk about Japan and Korea and Australia and others, do they, I think, either keep their head down vis-a-vis U.S. Trade tension, or do they seek to engage the EU? And I think that is a big question, because these countries have a real interest in keeping the EU in Europe sort of on side, quote unquote, when it comes to China policy. So I think there's a lot in the air, and I don't think it's, my guess is where Europe comes down is somewhere in the middle, perhaps not quite as hawkish, not as hawkish as Europe has sort of sounded and has acted during the Biden administration, not as concerned about Chinese spying. And when we talked about connected vehicles, I mean, that's very much a U.S. concern that we were pushing Europeans to also care about. And what we saw during the first Trump term is, you know, Europeans moving on Huawei technology for their telecom infrastructure, but then being sort of pushed to not engage in that. And I wonder whether Europe is going to be that concerned about Chinese espionage and Chinese intentions, because I think from a security standpoint, China is just simply less of a threat to Europe. So I think we're going to see some hedging actions from the Europeans should transatlantic relations really take a stumble. So from a broader perspective, I think there will be some alignment, particularly perhaps on climate, on the global climate dialogues and engagement. Economically, I think there's going to be a lot of friction still, but perhaps there'll be better vibes in Sino-European relations, particularly if China does not sort of adopt the wolf warrior diplomacy that it did during the first Trump term and sort of embraces European strategic autonomy, as it has sort of talked about and been excited about, but then has sort of adopted more of a salami slicing approach to Europe. So I think there's a lot of questions on how China also engages Europe.
Excellent. And I think I share that view that I think, you know, we should, unfortunately, it becomes too complicated sometimes to bring in Chinese speakers, European speakers, and American speakers because of time zone issues. But certainly that would be maybe a different event that we could have in the future, right? And actually Chinese views on Europe and US-Europe relations are quite interesting and evolving as well. Now, I think, share the concern about the salami slicing approach. I think that gets to some of the issues that Julia and Thomas were also mentioning, right? Where you could have diversified approaches and, I mean, frankly, sometimes different interests at the member state level, right? Some countries just don't have the same competition with China in certain sectors compared to other countries, right? And so how do you keep the union together? How do you sort of entice everybody to take on the same, for example, investment screening approach and sort of managing investment in different ways and ensuring that everybody actually requires the same sort of conditions around investment at a time when right now countries are very much free to do what they regulate investment, however, inbound investment, of course, however they want, which creates a lot of sort of, unproductive competition in many ways. And I think that's been a big concern. So maybe if, thoughts on this and how to actually implement some of these things. And what is, the European Union is a complicated polity where things are very difficult to actually move forward. Why don't we take the same, I guess, go back to Thomas, Julia, and Max.
Sorry, the mic is, yeah, here it is. Well, I mean, a great question, and fantastic, that I can start off with, how to solve all the issues that we just described. I mean, when it comes to the actual implementation and how to actually go about it, I mean, again, the supranational European level, of course, has its value, no question about it. But as a German, I am also, kind of leaning towards, I really see also a leadership role for Germany, and in particular also for the German new government to kind of also steer at least some of those discussions and also have some smart policy thinking and also encourage, obviously European solutions, but also offer support from our very special relationship with China. Because I think that's also the thing. We're not making the best use of our resources that we have when it comes to we have 50 years of economic relations with China. Mistakes were made, but also successes are, part of the story. And in Germany in general, the Chinese-German economic relationship is still heralded as an economic success story so far. Now there's, of course, a shift, and what we are doing with the shift, there was the implementation of the China strategy by the German federal government, the previous administration. I'm personally not a huge fan of, for me, actually, the current China strategy was just not explicit enough and actually did not have enough of what I'm saying when I'm saying smart policy thinking and actual proposals in terms of how to address the relationship to China. So if anything, I'm a big proponent of rewriting the China strategy and kind of, using everything that we've just talked about when it comes to very concrete proposals into economic security in general. Raising some of our defenses, like I mentioned, investment screenings and all the other implementations that we can do. But I think that would be a very good start. So, at least the German here at the table would say German can take a leadership role in also, proposing smart solutions that we will then take to Brussels. In that sense, Germany should not be afraid to lead. And I think I'll leave it at that for starters.
I think that's, excellent idea. And perhaps maybe many countries in Europe, other countries in Europe should also be thinking of their own China strategy, right? Which I think has been missing in many capitals, because I think, as Max also pointed out, China is not the main security challenge for the European Union, but it is an important one. And I think for many countries, it is increasingly sort of a topic. Julia, I'm moving to you. And I think, I think your battery point is very well taken. And I've written also about battery investments in Europe. And I think investment is definitely sort of going to be a key to developing a battery industry. But how do you actually sort of go about making actionable, suggestions and ensuring that the implementation actually goes the way that you're suggesting?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really excellent question. I would say that one of the issues we have with instruments like FDI screening is indeed the fact that it is up to the member states or the individual EU countries to implement. That's how it is today. That's where the weakness is. So what I would suggest is to add some of those conditions and framework on foreign direct investment directly to the tools where the Commission has direct power to implement them all across the member states. And I will point out two tools that are currently possible, available, and on the table. The first one are TDIs, so trade defense instruments. Similarly to EVs, the European Commission can decide to kick off, launch an anti-subsidy investigation into the battery value chain. Yes, to agree the new tariffs, of course, you would require the majority of the member states, but it could send a really strong signal to start the negotiation with China and to say, look, either we put a higher tariff on all of your cells, or if you want to avoid the tariffs, the investments you have here in Europe should be under the condition of a joint venture with a local partner, proper technology transfer, and those conditions, etc., etc. So this is number one. Use the TDI instrument to start the negotiation with China. I do believe that we as Europeans should actually not underestimate our leverage. Access to our market is leverage. The US market is closed to the Chinese battery manufacturers. European market remains the largest one in the world outside actually of US and China, and they're struggling in the Chinese market with demand, right? So it is a leverage. The second instrument is also something the Commission is directly looking at now. So the Commission is looking at state aid reform. This is the reform of the overall subsidy regime across the EU. The beauty of this is that the rules for that are decided directly by the Commission. So they set the guidelines and they're currently reforming them. Now, all of those Chinese investments that I have mentioned and that you're all aware of have all benefited actually from state aid in the countries where they are. For example, the CATL battery factory in Hungary got almost 1 billion promised by the Hungarian government. Right now, neither the Hungarian government nor the Commission are even allowed to add the conditions to it. But as they're reforming the state aid, now would be the time to reform it in a way that would say that if you are giving those subsidies to foreign entities, then there must be conditions around local control, IP, technology and skills transfer, etc., etc. So this is the second very practical route where you can add the conditions around foreign direct investment to make sure that that there are better value and better conditions from those investments in Europe.
Thank you. I think that's those are very actionable recommendations, and I'm sure somebody from the Commission will be listening. Max, I see you have unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's said. I would just say maybe more broadly, you know, this where I'm in Washington. Washington is full of people always talking about Nixon and Kissinger and dividing China and Russia. But really, I would imagine in Beijing, they're looking at the current state of the transatlantic relations and see a huge opportunity to try to wedge and divide the US and Europe. And that gives, I think, Brussels a lot of leverage. And if Ursula von der Leyen said, you know, went to the Chinese and said, look, if you want to have a new relationship with us, you cannot be salami slicing us and going and deliberately trying to divide the European Union. That, you know, and that can in some ways be a predicate for a broader engagement. That the EU has a lot of leverage. The EU, as in the EU Commission, I think has a lot of leverage given it oversees the economic relationship. And that I think is, you know, could be an important message for China to hear, also in its support for Russia. So I think the EU has actually a lot of leverage if it uses it and engages Beijing in sort of a broader and more strategic way. And the reason why they have leverage is because, you know, a lot of these companies are private, but can be tapped on the shoulder by Beijing and can operate in a different way if the EU takes notice and acts a different way towards Beijing. So in some ways, it's both, I think, about the member states, but then also how the EU approaches Beijing.
I think that's probably right. And I think, you know, one thing to note is China just had its 2 sessions. We had an event on this the other week, but there were several documents, the government work report, the NDRC report. And one thing that I noted was that you just see a lot of emphasis on doubling down on exports, right? Continuing to support Chinese exports. You know, this is not for this conversation, but also a lot of responses to CBAM. And actually what I found interesting in the responses to CBAM is that China is trying to build sort of a more cohesive carbon accounting system, which means that when Europe introduces rules, it actually does influence how things are done in China. Now, in the long term, that might mean that Chinese exports might become more compliant with CBAM and might actually be able to export to Europe, but that will mean higher costs in China, will mean less emissions, right? It will actually be a good outcome. And so I think, you know, thinking about the European Union's power when it does regulate imports from China in ways that can be sort of in the long term actually beneficial for global trade and for the European Union industry and also, you know, Chinese companies themselves as they might become more efficient in the way in which they produce, right? Right now, I would say the battery and EV industry in China is not ideal, right? The actual undermining of costs, China doesn't call it overcapacity anymore. We're talking about involution now. But, you know, it's essentially the same thing, right? This price cutting process where companies are operating really at that margin, leaving very little money for actually R&D and for profits is not actually ideal, right? So actually some sort of rebalancing in the long term might benefit China, but I don't actually see that's how the government is currently thinking about it. And so I think it would be, in the long term, actually beneficial to put more pressure in some, not necessarily in the long term. In the short term, it would be beneficial for Europe. And I think in the long term, actually for China too, if it were actually to rebalance its economy in ways that were a little less invasive for other countries globally. So I think, we have one time for one more round of sort of ending opening thoughts on how to look at this. What things are you looking forward to and looking out for over the next year? And what do you expect to be sort of the flashpoints? And this doesn't necessarily have to be EVs, right? EVs is sort of, I think, a leading example of a high profile issue in the EU-China relationship that affects trade, but also the energy transition, right? I think we've touched on this a little bit less, but I'm sure Julia is thinking a lot about this. So let me go back in inversely now and start with Max.
Well, it's a good question. I'm sort of looking at, does China react to this moment? Do they try to figure out, look at what are Europe's concerns, which I think are very much based on merit, economically, when it comes to market access, when it comes to dumping. Does it seek to, entice Europeans in some way economically? But then does it also take a more measured approach when it comes to how it diplomatically engages Europe? And I think the support for Russia will be a really critical aspect within the EU, because that will, I think, really shape how many Eastern European members see it. The Biden administration thought the EU had a lot of leverage with Beijing and went to Europe frequently and said, use your leverage to try to shift Europe, Russia's or China's red line, or your red lines about Chinese support to Russia. And it never really materialized. We've seen a lot of rhetoric. We've seen Europe raise Chinese support for the Russian defense industry, but no potential retaliatory steps. So what I'm looking for really is whether both China engages Europe in a way of, look, there's a deal to be had here in a more sort of measured way, and does Europe sort of engage China with a series of structured demands and requests. My guess is that we sort of get neither of both, and we kind of muddle along, but that in 4 years, particularly if transatlantic relations are set to get worse, that the Europe and China relations will be on kind of a more bizarrely more positive footing in many respects, but probably still quite bad in certain economic aspects.
That makes a lot of sense. Julia.
So I am mostly looking forward to or following two aspects. The first one would be indeed to bring back the energy transition policies. And I really hope that the EU does not massively change its stance around its EV policies. So the car CO2 standards, as we call them in Europe, especially the 2035 engine phase-out date. If we do go back on them, it would be detrimental to our EV transition, because all we're doing is just allowing car makers here in Europe to just go even slower. We are already behind. How going slower helps anyone is anyone's guess. Importantly, this really delays the affordability point of EVs in Europe. As you don't have to produce many of them, the standards are not there, so you can just continue doing premium SUVs, electric SUVs. However, it's the standards that are pushing you to sell more vehicles in the mass market, that are pushing you to do affordable EVs. It's no surprise that this is the first year, this year in Europe, that we are seeing more than 10 European affordable electric car models come into the market, because the standard, the 2025 EV standard, kicks in this year. So for energy transition, but it's also really important for the security of those battery investments that I talked about. So many CEOs of various battery companies that announced investments into batteries in Europe said, the first reason why I did this is because there's the 2035 engine phase out. So I have the guarantee of the market. So if we remove that investment certainty is out of the window. And with that, a lot of investments we want to actually onshore manufacturing. But the second thing I'm really looking forward to is something we spend most of the time discussing actually today, and it is for Europe to get its industrial investment policy on track and a lot better. I really hope we in Europe finally do something like the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, for batteries, so the production credits. We're working on that a lot. And alongside that, we do need a more assertive trade policy, most notably much stricter framework on foreign direct investment on batteries that I hope will come out of the Commission in the coming months.
Well, those are definitely things that I'll be watching out for as well. And I'll just note that I completely agree with you that the regulations on the EU side to meet current targets on electric vehicles and the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles are really central. And I think right now in the US, where there have been massive investments in the battery industry, you see a lot of anxiety from many of those companies that have made big investments and now are concerned about what demand will look like in the United States if there's a repeal of some of those portions of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think, having certain stability and predictability and actually strictness in regulation can really help push forward innovation on the part of companies. And I think that's what we said. That's one of the lessons from China, actually, frankly. So I think that I completely agree on that. Thomas, parting words.
Parting words. I will use the opportunity to raise a ruckus in Berlin, and I think I think everything that has been mentioned is just about a wake-up call. I think on the European Commission level, the call has been heard, but now it's all about the implementation. I do think on the German side, there needs to be a little bit more of a wake-up call. So I'm trying to do that while also smartly and charmingly balancing between the very real needs of the German business community in China and at the same time keeping economic security in mind. So striking that balance will keep me up at night, but I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And I think what Max mentioned about the European leverage that we also have towards our Chinese partners, I'm going to be thinking about how to actually leverage that and maintaining a solid relationship and a trusting relationship with the Chinese side as well. So I think, my docket is full. And that is basically what I'm also going to be taking with me from this time here in Washington, D.C., because, I refuse to not be a transatlantist and still kind of look for ways for cooperation and alignment as well to also leverage that relationship. So let's see how I'm doing in a year or so.
I think that's a very positive note to end things on, actually, right? I think we've heard a lot of reasons for concern in this call. I think this event has really highlighted issues that I think a lot of us have been thinking about, challenges in the relationship with China for Europe, challenges for European competitiveness, challenge for the European energy transition. But also I think, sort of this is a key moment, a key window of opportunity for improving things. And perhaps, hopefully in the next few years, we'll actually look back and see this as the moment in which tough decisions were made. And I think many of us have been pointing to what decisions need to be made. I think there's actually a consensus in many cases on what those decisions need to be, but actually getting the implementation right is going to be important. So hopefully we'll be able to meet again and talk about this in a year or two and have more positive assessments. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to everybody online who's been watching us. And I will just one last plug that to take a look at the paper, which will be coming out today. Thank you.